Section 22 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Etaf. The Reverend Leroy Chapin. He was a classmate of mine. We graduated together and settled at the same time. That is, I settled. He stopped at the village of blank. Well, I will take sober second thought and not give you the name, because I wish to remark that the church there didn't know enough to call my friend, so they invited him to preach for some months, an indefinite number, with a view to settling. That always means, provided the candidate does not carry a handkerchief with too broad a hem or too narrow a one, or wear his hair too long or too short. Some one of these abstruse and important questions very often determines the question of settlement. I know, for my grandfather was a minister, and my father was a minister, and I'm a minister. I have never been sorry, despite the handkerchief and the hair and similar worries. There are other things that compensate for even such trials as these. Well, Brother Chapin invited me to spend Christmas Eve with him, and attend his church festival. I was settled only 20 miles away from him. My wife had gone home to her father's to keep holiday. I was to follow as soon as I had performed the marriage ceremony for a couple who perversely chose Christmas morning for their entertainment. But weddings are not so plenty that I could afford to waste any of them. So here I was, with a Christmas Eve on my hand, wifeless and babyless. Hence my invitation. And as Chapin had neither wife nor baby, nor home anywhere, we thought we might as well be as comfortable as we could together. So I went, and his church held a festival. It was a brilliant affair. The church was a well-to-do one, somewhat in the country, plenty of wealthy farmers connected with it, and quite a number of people of culture. We had a very pleasant evening. I don't know when I have enjoyed myself better than I did there. It's queer to think, Brother Newton, that you were only 10 miles away from us, and neither of us knew you. And now you have come 1,000 miles in one direction, and I nearly as many from another, to be entertained at his home. This was what the Reverend Mr. Newton said, as he put his comfortably slippered feet on a velvet footstool, and leaned back in a luxurious easy-chair. Exactly. Life is a very strange thing. How many years is it since you spent Christmas Eve with Brother Chapin? 14 years to-night. It was Wednesday evening, I remember. Chapin is in his prime now. He has improved wonderfully, and I always thought he was a fine fellow. What suggested that Christmas Eve to you? Simply the fact that it occurred 14 years ago to-night? Oh, to be sure, that and some other things. I fell into a reverie and forgot my story. You remember Brother Chapin's leaving that church, or did you go west before he left? No, he went some months before I moved west. I heard all sorts of twisted and contradictory statements, but never the correct one, I presume. I left that region so soon afterwards. How was it? That Christmas Eve was the starting point. They had, as I told you, a church festival, and I presume you know by experience how ingenious Satan is at creeping into these affairs. I really thought, though, that he had been left in the lurch that evening, at least so far as a tangible form was concerned. There was no post office, nor ring cake, nor even a grab bag. They had a sumptuous supper, and everything was passing off delightfully. Over in one corner of the room, as much out of sight as possible, I noticed a pretty good-sized barrel. It had been covered with some sort of a spread early in the evening, and I mistook it for a table, but the cloth had slipped from it and disclosed a barrel. It struck me as rather singular. The other appointments of the hall were very good, and it did not seem probable that they were so hard up for tables. "What is that?" I said to Chapin as we stood near it. "That's a barrel," said he, solemnly. "Suppose you mean what is it here for? And I have not the least idea. It must have been needed for some purpose, but I should suppose they would have had it removed." Before the evening was over, we found out what that barrel was. It was a most ingeniously arranged thing. We admired the getting up of it a great many times since. You see, they had prepared a card for each man, woman, and child in creation, or in that neighborhood at least. Each card contained a line or two, I believe it was 2 lines of poetry, of a somewhat dreamy or mystical nature. Then they were piled up in a heap on the table, and every one bought a card. Oh, there were hundreds of them sold. 50 cents apiece they sold for. Now, it seems there are 2 cards that were duplicates, and one of these was tacked on to the head of the mysterious barrel. Only one young gentleman who managed the affair was in the secret as to which card was duplicated. Then the house was called to order soon after supper, and it was announced that the game of Etaf would be played. Nobody knew what Etaf meant. At least, Chapin and I didn't, and we listened with the rest. We might have known that there was a secret, and that a good many were in it, for the din had been indescribable 3 minutes before this, but they were as quiet as mice after the game was announced. Somebody put a card into Chapin's hand, and another into mine, and oracularly stated that whenever the word on our cards was spoken, we were to read the line on the other side aloud. I neglected to say that there was some common or queer word on each card, in addition to the lines on the other side. It was then announced that the presiding genius of the game of Etaf had appeared to them in the form of a barrel, that whoever pronounced a sentiment entirely in unison with his feelings would have signal proof of his favor before the conclusion of the game. There was a fellow in Chapin's congregation, at least, his folks were in it. He was a lawyer in New York, a sharp fellow and a real wit. He came forward at this point, and began to tell a story. It was so absurd, Newton, so altogether ridiculous, that I would give considerable to have you hear it. Every few sentences a word from one of the cards would be introduced in a most ingenious manner, and up would start somebody and repeat the sentence on his card. I tell you, Newton, I never laughed so much in my life as I did that evening. Those quotations came in such a way as to make a complete absurdity. We were in the very height of the frolic when the word on my card was called, and I responded. The roar of laughter which greeted my reading had not subsided when we were startled by a very sepulchral voice solemnly repeating the same sentence. I wish I could remember what it was. I know it was ridiculous in the extreme. Well, so far as we could discover, the barrel had found its chosen affinity, and out it walked from its corner into the very middle of the room, halting directly in front of me. I tell you, for a minute I actually was startled. There were great bursts of laughter, and voices called, "Open it! Open it!" So there seemed nothing for me to do but obey, and I lifted the cover in a very gingerly manner. Inside sat a youngster of 12 or so, with eyes as large as moons, and he held up to my view a single golden pippin, held it by a ribbon tied to the stem. I solemnly took it, and around it was pasted a strip of paper, whereon was written, "Touch me not, the barrel is yours. I belong to the Reverend Leroy Chapin." And to that gentleman I immediately handed it. It was tremendously heavy, and I began to suspect something. So on the impulse of the moment I challenged him for a piece of it, and he in the same spirit produced his knife and attempted to cut it. As I suspected, the inside had been dug out, and its skin was almost literally full of gold dollars. At this instant, Chapin's Sunday school scholars, who had been previously instructed, began to call out from every quarter of that room, "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas!" and older ones took it up and shouted until you couldn't hear yourself think. Now, Newton, I want to know if you ever knew Satan to get up a more ingenious device for introducing a lottery into the Church of Christ, and making the pastor of that church a leading participant in it." "A lottery?" said Mr. Newton, with a puzzled face. "Why, yes, don't you see? They had sold tickets to everybody. Actually, hundreds of people around the country had bought. Only a select half dozen or so were in the secret. The rest knew that they were competing for a prize. Some of the money that was realized for the tickets they converted into gold as a gift for the pastor. I think there were $100, and they had a handsome surplus left for church and Sunday school purposes. I certainly never saw a poor man put in such a position before. It was especially hard for Brother Chapin, you see, for if there was anything that he hated with entire and righteous hatred, it was gambling in all of its forms." "What did he do?" asked Brother Newton. He had taken his feet from the velvet ottoman and was sitting erect, his face full of sympathy for our Brother Chapin. "Do? He did what very few of us would have had the courage to do. For some minutes he didn't take it in at all. He saw the money and that it was a pleasant sight, for Chapin was poor. They gave him a starving salary, and I knew he could spend the $100 100 ways for his actual needs. Presently he said to me, 'Sanborn, what on earth am I to do? I can't keep this.'" "Can't keep it!" I repeated like a parrot, and full of astonishment. "No, I can't. Don't you see it's a lottery? They are talking all around us about having tickets, and it's even worse than an ordinary lottery. There was actually nothing but an old barrel to strive after." "But they did it as a present for you," I said, eagerly enough, for I was anxious for him to have the money. He shook his head. "No, there isn't that excuse. I heard young Butler telling someone that there was just 6 of them in the secret, and the rest thought they were striving for a valuable present." "But they understood that the money so procured would be given to you for a Christmas present, Chapin. They certainly must have been told that much," I said, still personating Satan, you see. But he answered me almost sternly. "I cannot be put up at lottery, at all events, if I never have a Christmas present." And his eyes were pretty stern as he said it. I tell you, I was at my wits' ends. Of course I foresaw a terrific storm if the gift was returned, and I loved Chapin like a brother. I couldn't bear to have him in deep waters. "My dear boy," I said coaxingly, "couldn't we arrange it somehow?" Text missing. It is an error of ignorance. They want to do you honor, and it will grieve and offend and make trouble in your church to decline the gift. Can't you overlook the matter because of the motive that prompted?" He turned towards me with that penetrating look of his. "Get thee behind me, Satan," he said, with an attempt at playfulness. "Sanborn, you wouldn't have me do it. Overlook the act, tolerate a lottery, because it brings $100 to me, but frown upon it when the money belongs to others. That is what the enemies of Christ would say of me, and with good show of reason. I know I shall be misunderstood and lose many friends, perhaps lose my church. But I must not do evil that good may come. It just cuts me like a knife to think of returning it, but I must do it. I believe it is right. The Lord can take care of me." He went forward without another word and called the assembly to order. I would give much to be able to tell you what he said. It was tender, gentle, grateful, yet earnest and solemn. It seemed to me that it ought to melt all hearts. There were tears in my own eyes, but neither tears nor melting were there, I can tell you. Why, it was a regular uproar. I had to leave by the very early train, and I went to Massachusetts the next morning. But when I came home, the first thing I did was to run down and see him. I found him in deep trouble. The most outrageous stories were afloat, twisted and turned to suit the narrator's particular views of the festival, until it seemed to me that the very powers of darkness were arrayed against the poor man. My heart ached for him. I went hither and thither through the village, trying to make things plainer and smooth some of the ruffled feelings, but I might as well have talked to a court of chestnut burrs. I couldn't reason with them any more than you can with pins. I never saw anybody who fancied that his generosity had been undervalued that you could reason with. I asked Chapin if he ever felt that perhaps it would have been wiser, all things considered, to have kept the money and appropriated it to some public use, but he shook his head emphatically. "I haven't been given over to that feeling," he said decidedly, "though I think I have had every other discouraging one that ever mortal endured. But in this case there wasn't room to doubt. It wasn't done in ignorance, Sanborn. If it had been, I do think they would have taken the explanation better. It is not so much that they are hurt as that they tried to entrap me and failed. It is a gambling community. The ladies buy their tea of those who offer a prize for every third pound, and the gentlemen buy their cigars in the same manner. The very children, when they go to town on the cars, come back laden with prize candy and prize popcorn. The people know how I hate it all. I have preached against it and talked against it, and I am obliged to think that they, knowing my poverty, meant to give me a great temptation, and arrange it so that I almost could not escape, in order to silence my troublesome voice." "The whole thing was abominable," Brother Newton said excitedly. "And so that was the occasion of his leaving that church so soon?" "Just that, and not any of the 150 absurdities that were told at the time. I was mad for 6 weeks right straight through all the time about it. Isn't it a strange thing, Brother Newton, that the Lord sends such trials to a man like Chapin, who seemed to need them so little?" "It is strange," Newton said thoughtfully. "That is, it seems difficult for us to understand the why, but I presume the Master knows just why he does it. It didn't crush Brother Chapin, anyway." "Oh, no, he wasn't crushed by any means. At least, not for any length of time. But it was a bitter trial, and I never could get the least glimpse of the working together for good that there must have been in it. However, as you suggest, it is a great comfort to know that we haven't it to manage." Then we both left Brother Chapin's luxurious study and went down to his elegant parlors. We were spending Christmas together, Newton, my new ministerial friend, and Chapin, the friend of my boyhood, in the latter's beautiful city home. He was not in the parlors when we went down, but Mr. Osborne, a gray-haired member of the church, was, and arose to greet us. "Be seated, gentlemen. Mr. Chapin will be back in a few moments." I, full of the story that I have been telling, said, as I took a rocking chair, "I have been telling my friend, Mr. Sanborn, about the last Christmas Eve I spent with my brother Chapin." "Ah," he said, in a tone of courteous indifference. 14 years tonight." He turned towards me promptly. "That was in blank," bestowing a very searching look. "Were you there on Christmas Eve?" "Indeed I was." "Then you know all about the golden pippin?" "Decidedly I do. Did Mr. Chapin tell you of it?" "I did not need to be told. I was an eyewitness." It was my turn to be surprised. "How was that?" I asked curiously. "Oh, it all happened, as we Christians have a reverent way of saying. I have an old uncle, or had, in that township, and I ran down there that Christmas Eve for the sake of old times. Now, I've a mind to tell you something that Brother Chapin doesn't know himself. If I had not been there that night, and both seen and heard the golden pippin, in all human probability Mr. Chapin would never have been our pastor. We love him for 1,000 reasons now, but we began by admiring the noble, difficult, manly course that he took that night." Then the old gentleman came over to my side and bent down to speak in a lower tone. "Since you know about the other matter, I'll tell you another thing that Mr. Chapin doesn't know yet. There's more than one golden pippin in the world, you know. We have one for him that is free from any taint of gambling. We want to blot out the painful memory if we can, and give him something pleasant to think of when he eats apples after this. I wonder we didn't think of it years ago. It is to be presented at our anniversary exercises this evening. It isn't filled with gold dollars, but with very good representatives of them after all. It's pretty well filled up with national greenbacks." "And how much do they count?" I asked with eagerness. $1,000. The old gentleman answered me. "Pretty fair, isn't it? And it's the free will offering of a loving people. Every man, woman, and child in the congregation is represented, not because we couldn't easily have made up the amount without them, but because they wanted to be in it. The little children in the infant class, the very weest of them, are to present it." Our host came in at this point, and I could do no more than look my appreciation of the delicate courtesy. "Things are working together all the time, it seems, even though you and I can't see it." This was my brother Newton's aside to me as we went out to dinner. Seated in the elegant uptown church of which my brother Chapin is now the pastor, it was during one of the anniversary addresses to which Brother Newton seemed to be listening, that he suddenly turned to me, and covering his mouth with his hand, whispered, "What does Etaf mean?" Despite my ministerial dignity that had to be maintained, I laughed as I whispered back, "It was a lottery business all through. Spell it backwards." End of section 22.